The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger with each passing minute. Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the cracked window of their small farmhouse, her heart pounding as she watched the approaching riders. 3 children clung to her worn cotton dress, their small fingers gripping the fabric like lifelines in a storm that was about to break over their peaceful valley. "Mama, who are those men?" whispered 8-year-old Emma, her voice barely audible above the sound of thundering hooves that grew closer by the second. Sarah's throat felt dry as sandpaper. She recognized the black bandanas and the way they rode in formation. The Blackwater gang had been terrorizing settlements across 3 counties for months, leaving nothing but burned homes and broken families in their wake. She had prayed they would never find her little piece of land tucked away in this remote valley, but prayers sometimes went unanswered in the harsh reality of the frontier. "Stay quiet, children," she managed to say, pulling 5-year-old Miguel closer while baby Anna slept peacefully in her arms, unaware of the danger approaching their home. The riders came to a halt just outside their wooden fence. Sarah counted 12 men, all armed with rifles and revolvers, their faces hard as the rocky hills that surrounded their farm. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and cold gray eyes, dismounted slowly and walked toward their front door with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Sarah's husband had been gone for 2 weeks, traveling to the nearest town to sell their cattle and buy supplies for the coming winter. He should have been back days ago, but the roads were dangerous, and she tried not to think about what might have delayed him. Now, as she faced these dangerous men alone, she wished desperately that he was here to protect his family. The heavy knock on their door echoed through the small house like gunshots. Sarah's children moved closer to her, their eyes wide with fear. She had heard the stories from other settlements about what happened when the Blackwater gang visited. They took whatever they wanted, burned what they could not carry, and left families with nothing but ash and memories. "Open up in there," the leader called out, his voice rough as gravel. "We know you're home, lady. We seen the smoke from your chimney." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of what to do. Their nearest neighbors lived 10 miles away, too far to hear any calls for help. She had her husband's old rifle hanging above the fireplace, but she was one woman against 12 armed men. Even if she could fight, what would happen to her children if something went wrong? The knocking came again, harder this time, making the wooden door shake on its hinges. "I'm coming," Sarah called out, her voice steadier than she felt inside. She gently moved the children behind her and walked slowly toward the door, each step feeling like it might be her last as a free woman. She opened the door just wide enough to see the leader's face. Up close, she could see the scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, and the way his eyes looked at her like she was nothing more than another obstacle to remove from his path. "Good morning, ma'am," he said with a smile that held no warmth. "Name's Jake Morrison. Me and my boys have been riding hard for days, and we're in need of supplies. Food, water, maybe a place to rest for a spell." Sarah knew this was not a request. Men like Morrison did not ask permission for anything. They simply took what they wanted and dealt with the consequences later. "I don't have much," she said quietly. "Just enough for my children and myself." Morrison's smile grew wider, showing teeth stained yellow from tobacco. "Well now, that's where you're wrong, lady. You got plenty to share. We can see your garden out back, and I'm betting you got a root cellar full of preserved food. Winter's coming, and a smart woman like yourself would have prepared for it." Behind Morrison, his men spread out around the house like wolves circling wounded prey. Sarah could hear them checking the barn and looking through their small shed where her husband kept his tools. The sound of their boots on the wooden porch told her that some of them had already moved to block any escape route. "Please," Sarah said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I have 3 young children. Whatever you take, please leave us enough to survive the winter." Morrison laughed, a sound as cold as winter wind. "Survival ain't guaranteed for nobody out here, lady. You should know that by now. The strong take what they need, and the weak make do with what's left." Emma appeared beside her mother, her small hand slipping into Sarah's. The sight of the innocent child seemed to amuse Morrison rather than soften his heart. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, crouching down to Emma's level. "Pretty little thing, ain't she? But she'd fetch a good price in certain places I know." Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She pulled Emma behind her so quickly that the child stumbled, but she did not care about being gentle now. The meaning behind Morrison's words was clear, and it filled her with a terror deeper than any fear for her own life. "You will not touch my children," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. Morrison stood up slowly, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. "Now, see, that's where you got things backwards, lady. Out here, I touch whatever I want to touch. I take whatever I want to take. And right now, I'm thinking your family has a lot to offer my boys and me." The other men had finished their search of the property and were gathering behind their leader, their faces showing the same cruel interest that Sarah had seen in Morrison's eyes. She realized with growing horror that they were not just here for supplies. They had been riding for weeks, far from any town or settlement, and men like these had other needs beyond food and water. "Please," she whispered, no longer caring how desperate she sounded. "I'll give you everything we have. All our food, our money, anything you want. Just please leave my children alone." "Oh, you'll give us everything anyway," Morrison said with certainty. "Question is whether you're going to make this easy on yourself and your little ones, or if we're going to have to take what we want the hard way." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, but every scenario ended the same way. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely at their mercy. Her children would suffer no matter what choice she made, but perhaps if she cooperated, Morrison might show some small amount of mercy. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. Morrison's grin showed that he had been expecting this question. "First, you're going to invite us in for a meal. Then, you're going to show us where you keep your valuables. After that, well, we'll see how the day goes." Sarah nodded slowly, knowing she had no choice but to play along and hope for some miracle to save her family. She stepped back to let Morrison into her home, her heart breaking as she watched her children's safe world crumble around them. The men filed into their small house, their dirty boots leaving mud on the clean floors that Sarah had scrubbed just that morning. They looked around with the eyes of men evaluating property, noting the handmade furniture her husband had built and the few precious items they owned. "Nice little place you got here," Morrison said, settling into her husband's chair at their kitchen table. "Real homey, but you work hard to keep it so clean and pretty." Sarah moved mechanically toward their small kitchen, her mind focused on keeping her children as far away from these men as possible. Miguel had started crying softly, sensing the danger even though he could not fully understand it. Baby Anna had woken up and was beginning to fuss in her arms. "Emma, take Miguel to your room and stay there," Sarah said quietly. "But, Mama," Emma started to protest. "Do as I say, right now," Sarah said with a firmness that made Emma nod quickly and take her little brother's hand. As the children disappeared into their small bedroom, Morrison gestured for his men to make themselves comfortable. They sat heavily in chairs that creaked under their weight and propped their muddy boots on her clean table. "Now, this is more like it," one of them said, a younger man with mean eyes and hands that moved restlessly over his weapons. "Been too long since we had a proper roof over our heads." Sarah began preparing food with shaking hands, pulling bread and preserved meat from their pantry. Each item she took meant less food for her children later, but she tried not to think about the winter months ahead. Right now, surviving the next few hours was all that mattered. As she worked, she could hear the men talking quietly among themselves, their voices carrying suggestions that made her stomach turn. She caught fragments of their conversation about how long they might stay and what they planned to do with their time, and each word filled her with deeper dread. Morrison watched her move around the kitchen like a cat watching a mouse. "You're awful quiet, lady. Why don't you tell us about yourself? Where's your husband hiding himself?" "He's away on business," Sarah managed to say. "He'll be back soon." "Is that so?" Morrison's voice carried disbelief. Funny thing about husbands, they usually don't leave their families unprotected in dangerous country like this. Makes me think maybe your man ain't coming back at all. Sarah's hands stilled as she sliced bread. The possibility that something had happened to her husband was something she had been trying not to think about, but Morrison's words forced her to face her worst fears. "He's coming back," she said quietly, as much to convince herself as to answer Morrison. "Maybe he is, maybe he ain't," Morrison said with a shrug. "Don't matter much to us either way. We'll be long gone before any help arrives, and we'll take whatever we want with us when we go." The bread knife slipped in Sarah's trembling hands, cutting a small line across her finger. She watched the blood drop onto the cutting board and felt a moment of clarity cut through her fear. These men were going to destroy her family no matter what she did. Cooperation would not save her children. Begging would not touch their hearts. The only thing that might help was time and prayer for some kind of miracle. As she bandaged her finger with a strip of cloth, she heard the sound that would change everything. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the noise of the men talking and laughing in her home. But as it grew closer, she recognized the steady rhythm of a single horse approaching at an easy pace. Morrison heard it too. His hand moved to his gun as he stood up and walked to the window. "Looks like you might have a visitor coming," he said to Sarah. "Friend of yours?" Sarah moved to look out the window, her heart racing with hope and fear. A lone rider was approaching their house, still too far away to make out clearly. She prayed it might be her husband returning, but the horse looked wrong, and the way the rider sat in his saddle was different from the man she had married. "Don't recognize him," Morrison said to his men, "but one man ain't going to cause us no trouble. Billy, you and Tom go out and greet our guest. Make sure he understands he's not welcome to stay." Two of Morrison's men stood up and checked their weapons before walking toward the door. Sarah watched them go with a sinking heart, knowing that whoever was riding toward their house was about to walk into a trap that could cost him his life. The lone rider came closer, and Sarah could see that he was tall and lean, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face, and his clothes were the practical gear of someone who worked outdoors for a living. Most importantly, she could see the gun belt around his waist and the way his hand rested near his weapon. Morrison's men positioned themselves on either side of the front door, their rifles ready. They were clearly planning to take the stranger by surprise, using their numbers to overwhelm him before he could react. But as the rider drew near enough for Sarah to see his face clearly, something about him made her catch her breath. There was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet alertness that suggested he was not the easy target that Morrison's men were expecting. His eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of the scene before him, and she saw him notice the extra horses tied up behind their house. The stranger brought his horse to a stop about 50 feet from their front door, well out of range of any sudden attack. He sat quietly for a long moment, studying the situation with the patience of a man who had learned not to rush into anything without understanding what he was facing. "Morning," he called out in a voice that carried clearly across the yard. "Wonder if I might trouble you folks for some water for my horse." It was a simple request, politely made, but Sarah could hear something underneath the words that made Morrison frown. This was not a man who could be easily intimidated or fooled. Morrison gestured for his men to stay hidden and stepped outside himself.